Was the wisest man who ever lived, a king blessed with unparalleled wisdom, wealth, and power. His name was Solomon. And yet, he fell. Not to an enemy, not to a war, but to a trap far more dangerous, a trap that ensnares even the strongest among us. The trap of lust. A man so wise, so favored by God, falls so far. What was it about lust that made even Solomon, the man who wrote Proverbs, the man who built the temple, stumble? And here's the real question. If it could happen to him, could it happen to us? Solomon's story is not just a tale of ancient history. It's a mirror, a warning, a call to action. Because the trap of lust doesn't just catch the foolish or the weak. It catches the wise, the strong, the chosen. And the price? It's higher than you think. Solomon lost everything, his wisdom, his kingdom, his peace. But here's the twist. His story doesn't end in despair, because even in his darkest moment, Solomon found a way back, a way to redemption, a way to hope. Because the story of Solomon is not just about one man, it's about all of us. And the trap of lust, it's a lesson we all must learn. For the fall, there was the rise, and what a rise it was. Solomon was not just any king, he was the son of David, chosen by God to rule over Israel. When he first took the throne, he was young, inexperienced, but he was humble. He knew the weight of his responsibility, and so he prayed and asked for wealth. He didn't ask for power, he asked for wisdom. Wisdom he received. More than any man before him, more than any man after him. His wisdom became legendary. Rulers from distant lands traveled just to hear his words. He judged fairly, he governed justly. Under Solomon's reign, Israel flourished. Silver was as common as stone. The temple of the Lord stood in unmatched glory. And the greatest empires crumble when the foundation is cracked. And Solomon's foundation cracked from within. A power attracts power, and for Solomon, the test came wrapped in royalty. The Queen of Sheba, a ruler of great wealth, a woman of intelligence and beauty, arrived in Jerusalem. She brought more than gold, spices, and rare jewels. She brought questions. Solomon had answers. Conversation stretched for days, filled with riddles, philosophy, and wisdom. But beneath the surface of admiration lay something deeper, something far more dangerous. Desire of Sheba was no ordinary guest. She was a woman who commanded respect, who carried herself with power, and Solomon, for all his wisdom, was not immune to her charm. She tested his knowledge, his intellect, but also his heart. Solomon see in her? Was it her beauty, her intelligence, or was it the thrill of someone who could match his greatness? Started with admiration, in temptation. Sheba was only the beginning. The doors of Solomon's palace were always open to foreign dignitaries, to kings and queens, to rulers from across the lands, and with them came their daughters, their princesses, their women, who worshipped other gods, women who whispered in Solomon's ear, women who turned his heart away. A sudden fall, it never is. One compromise at a time, one rationalization after another. Who had once declared that the fear of the Lord was the beginning of wisdom, began to fear losing the affections of the women he had surrounded himself with. So he built temples for them, as to gods he once despised, shrines to idols that had no power. And the man who had built the most magnificent temple for the Lord now watched as foreign gods rose in the land of Israel. Happened to the man who had been given wisdom beyond measure. It is simple. It blinded him. The nature of sin to deceive, to make itself seem harmless. It whispers, just this once, it's not that serious. You can control it. Solomon, the wisest man on earth, believed the lie. He believed he was still in control. He wasn't. Wisdom began to crack. That once defined Israel was breaking apart. The people murmured, the elders shook their heads in dismay. The prophet of God who once spoke blessings over Solomon's reign now carried a different message. It was coming. The God of Israel would not be mocked. The wisest man had become the greatest fool. Consequences were irreversible. Wives he loved so much, they weren't just a distraction, they were a destruction. They brought division, rebellion, and idolatry into the heart of God's people. Solomon had compromised, his kingdom would be torn apart. The kingdom that had once stood as a beacon of light, a testimony of God's faithfulness, would be divided. Solomon's lifetime, the lifetime of his son. His fall was not just personal, it was generational. Isn't that the truth about sin? It just affects one person. It spreads, it poisons, it leaves a legacy. His king, who once wrote proverbs warning men about lust, about temptation, about the dangers of foreign women, ignored his own wisdom. He became the very man he had warned others about. In the end, the great king, the man with 1,000 wives and concubines, the ruler who had everything, with a heart full of regret. Ecclesiastes, written at the end of his life, holds the words of a man who had seen it all, done it all, had it all. He wrote, "He of vanities, all is vanity." He chased pleasure, he had chased power, he had chased wealth. In the end, he found nothing. Solomon's story is a warning. The trap of lust? It isn't just a temptation, it's a slow, quiet destruction. It doesn't take you down in an instant. It wears you down over time. It makes you compromise. It makes you blind. You finally realize what has happened. Late. The question have to be, Solomon's story ended in regret. Yours doesn't have to. Solomon's greatest mistake wasn't just falling into sin, staying there. You don't have to. The way back. The way is repentance. No matter how far you've gone, no matter how many mistakes you've made, no matter how many times you've fallen into the trap, there is still a way out. The God who warned Solomon is the same God who offers grace today. The choice is yours. Learn from Solomon's mistakes. You repeat them. The trap of lust is real. So is the power of redemption. You choose. The prophet had returned, not with words of comfort, but with a message of judgment. The people of Israel, weary and divided, gathered in silence. Their eyes, filled with fear, turned toward the man who had once warned their king. This was no ordinary day. This was a reckoning. Hush fell over the temple courtyard. The weight of expectation pressed upon the air as the prophet stepped forward. His robes were simple, his presence commanding. He did not speak at first. He only looked at them. Looked at their fear, their uncertainty, their hope. Then he raised his hands and his voice rang out like thunder. Word of the Lord, O Israel. Thus says the Lord, I gave you a king, wise and just, to lead you in my ways, but he has turned his heart from me, chasing after foreign gods, indulging in the desires of his flesh. Therefore, the kingdom will be torn from his hands. Words sliced through the air like a blade. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children. Old men shook their heads, whispering prayers under their breath. At the edge of the courtyard, Eliab stood motionless. His face paled as he listened. He had known, he had seen the signs, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. Another voice, one filled with anger, with defiance. Who are you to speak such words? Who are you to judge the anointed of the Lord? The crowd parted as King Solomon himself stepped forward. His robe, once the emblem of divine favor, now felt heavy upon his shoulders. His eyes, once bright with wisdom, were clouded with rage. He stood on the temple steps, gazing down at the man who had dared to challenge him. It met Solomon's gaze without flinching. His voice was steady, unyielding. I am but a messenger, Solomon. The Lord has spoken, and his word cannot be undone. You have forsaken him, and now he will forsake you. Silence heavier than stone settled upon the people. Some turned their eyes away, unable to bear the weight of what was unfolding before them. And, like a whisper carried on the wind, the memories came flooding back. Solomon, kneeling before the Lord in this very temple, hands lifted in surrender, his heart yearning for wisdom. A man who had sought to rule with justice and honor. But that man was gone, and in his place stood a king who had strayed too far. It stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Solomon, turn from your sins and seek the Lord's mercy. There is still time, but the window is closing. Solomon's breath caught. A flicker of something crossed his face, doubt, fear, regret, but it was gone as quickly as it came. I repent, will the Lord restore what has been lost? His gaze softened, but his words remained firm. The consequences of your actions cannot be undone, but repentance will save your soul, if not your kingdom. Proud Eliab took a step forward. His voice was urgent, pleading. Listen to him. This is your chance to make things right. Do not let pride stand in the way of mercy. It grew thick with tension. Solomon looked from Eliab to the prophet. The weight of the moment pressed down upon him. Here, before all of Israel, he stood at a crossroads. One path led to redemption, to humility, to grace. The other, ruin. The crowd held its breath. Solomon straightened. His expression hardened, and his decision was made. King, I will not be dictated to by a man who claims to speak for God. It closed his eyes. The sorrow in his face was deeper than the sea. When he opened them again, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried through the courtyard like a storm. You have chosen your path, Solomon, and the consequences will be eternal. The prophet turned and walked away. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. The temple steps seemed taller as Solomon stood alone, watching the man disappear into the horizon. Like the first warning of an approaching storm, a low rumble of thunder echoed across the sky. People whispered among themselves. Mothers clutched their children tighter, and somewhere in the distance, the first drops of rain began to fall. This was made, the warning was given, and the fall of a king became inevitable. Tuned, for the fall of a king is not just a tragedy, it is a warning and a lesson for us all. It was heavy with silence. All of Israel had gathered in the temple courtyard, their eyes shifting between each other, uncertain of what was to come. They had heard the whispers, the rumors. But now, standing before them, was the man who had once warned their king, the prophet. Still, his gaze piercing. His robes were simple, yet his presence commanded respect. He did not need to shout to silence the crowd. His very presence did that. The word of the Lord has come to me, he said. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of judgment. Israel, hear the word of the Lord. I gave you a king, wise, powerful, just, to lead you in my ways. I gave him wisdom beyond all men, and yet he has turned his heart from me. He has bowed before false gods. He has abandoned righteousness for his own desires. And so the kingdom will be torn from his hands. Rippled through the crowd. The words struck them like a hammer, each syllable reverberating through the walls of the temple. Eliab stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. He had seen the king's descent, seen the choices Solomon had made, but to hear the judgment spoken aloud, it was something else entirely. Then, another voice, cold, defiant, knew to speak such words. The crowd parted as King Solomon stepped forward. He stood at the top of the temple steps, his robe flowing behind him like a shadow. His face, once radiant with wisdom, was now hardened with pride. He narrowed his eyes at the prophet below him. You to judge the anointed of the Lord. The prophet did not flinch. He met the king's gaze and spoke with quiet authority. But a messenger. The Lord has spoken, and his word cannot be undone. You have forsaken him, and now he will forsake you. The people fell deathly silent. Like a whisper carried by the wind, a memory flickered in Solomon's mind. A version of himself, kneeling in this very temple. The presence of the Lord filling the air around him. His voice trembling as he prayed, asking not for wealth, not for power, but for wisdom. And the Lord had answered. It was a long time ago. It stepped forward, lowering his voice. His next words were not for the crowd, they were for Solomon alone. And Solomon, turn from your sins and seek the Lord's mercy. There is still time, but the window is closing. Flickered in Solomon's eyes. Doubt, fear, guilt. I repent, will the Lord restore what has been lost? The prophet sighed. His expression softened, but his voice remained firm. The consequences of your actions cannot be undone, but repentance will save your soul, if not your kingdom. Proud Eliab stepped forward, desperation in his voice. King, listen to him. This is your chance to make things right. Do not let pride stand in the way of mercy. Tension in the air was suffocating. The weight of the moment pressed upon Solomon like a crushing stone. The flicker in his eyes vanished, or tightened, his gaze hardened. The king, I will not be dictated to by a man who claims to speak for God. Fell over the temple. The people waited, breathless, as the prophet slowly nodded. You have chosen your path, Solomon, and the consequences will be eternal. He turned and walked away, his robes brushing against the stone. The crowd parted before him, unwilling to meet his gaze. Solomon stood motionless, watching him disappear. And then, a distant rumble rolled across the sky. A warning. A promise. Drops of rain began to fall. This was made, the warning was given, and the fall of a king became inevitable. His reflection. Night Solomon sat alone in his chambers. The storm outside raged, the wind howling through the palace corridors, but the storm within him was far worse. Still hear the prophet's words. Forsaken him, and now he will forsake you. Solomon shut his eyes, gripping the arms of his throne. He had once been so sure of himself, so sure of his wisdom, so sure of his choices, but now doubt gnawed at him like a relentless beast. Father David had warned him once, the Lord has given you wisdom, but wisdom alone will not save you. A heart that is not steadfast in the Lord will surely fall. Fallen. Knock at the door. He turned sharply. The queen entered, her face pale with worry. King, she whispered, the people are afraid. They speak of curses, of judgment. You must address them. And let out a bitter laugh. Did I say, my queen, that I have failed them, that I have failed God? Closer. You are human. Tell them you have made mistakes, but tell them you are still their king. Solomon said nothing. He only turned to the window, watching the rain pound against the glass. In the distance, thunder rolled again. He approaches. It passed. Then weeks. The kingdom grew restless. The people whispered in the streets, and then, one day, messengers arrived. An army approaches. And rose to his feet. Army. Israel swallowed hard. The of Israel have united. They see our weakness, and they are coming. Those words settled over the room like a shroud. He gripped the edge of his throne. The Lord had truly turned his face from him. His enemies no longer feared him. His kingdom, once strong, now stood vulnerable. We must act, his general urged. We must seek the Lord's favor before it's too late. And turned away. God has turned from me. I am powerless to stop this. Words carried no anger, only resignation. All night. Eve of the battle, Solomon sat alone in the temple, the place he had built, the place where God had once spoken to him. But now the silence was deafening. Before the altar, his voice barely above a whisper. Lord, forgive me. I have sinned. I have turned from you. But if there is still mercy left, do not abandon your people. No answer. No voice from the heavens, only the sound of rain, distant drums of war. Of a king. King came, the enemy arrived. The battle was swift, the kingdom divided. The power Solomon had once held slipped through his fingers like sand. Oh, the greatest king Israel had ever known fell. Health, his wisdom, his power, all meant nothing in the end. The warning had been given, the choice had been made, and the consequences were eternal. The fall of a king, a warning for all generations. The storm had not yet passed. The rain drummed against the rooftops of Jerusalem. The wind howled through the palace halls, carrying whispers of a kingdom on the brink of ruin. In those halls, King Solomon sat alone, once gilded throne, now a hollow reminder of what he had lost. One sat on the table before him, its golden surface reflecting the flickering candlelight. But to him, it felt heavier than ever. Believed he was untouchable. the wisest ruler to ever walk the earth, the chosen one. He was but a man, humbled, broken, and abandoned by the very God who had given him everything. At the door, he did not turn, he already knew who it was. King. This was familiar. The voice of Eliab, his most trusted servant, his closest friend. He is at our gates, the people are waiting, what shall I tell them? Solomon did not answer. Instead, he let out a breath, a long, weary exhale that carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of regret. He murmured, "Tell them that their king has failed them." Days before the fall, a time when Solomon had been beloved, a ruler of unparalleled wisdom, a man who spoke and the world listened. Built the great temple, crafted with gold and stone, a dwelling place for the Lord himself. Judged with fairness, his wisdom a beacon for all who sought justice. Somewhere along the way his heart had changed. It did not happen all at once. First it was a whisper, a compromise, a single step off the path. An alliance, a political marriage, a shrine built to appease a wife's gods. Compromise never stays small, it grows, it demands more. Before he knew it, Solomon was no longer the man he had once been. The man who had once prayed for wisdom above all else was now a slave to his own indulgence. The man who had once spoken of righteousness had become the very thing he once condemned. The king had come long ago, but he had ignored it. Judgment was at his door. Its final warning. All of Israel gathered once more in the temple courtyard. It had returned. His presence was not one of comfort, but of reckoning. "The Lord has spoken," he declared. "Because you have turned from him, because you have defiled his name, the kingdom shall be torn from you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The weight of the words settled over them like a suffocating fog. Temple steps Solomon watched. His expression was unreadable. "I came to speak for God," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "Yet the Lord has blessed my reign. The temple I built stands as proof of his favor." It did not waver. He met Solomon's gaze, his voice steady. "Never about the temple, Solomon. It was about your heart." Then the prophet spoke the words that sealed Solomon's fate. "You have turned away because your heart has strayed. The Lord has torn the kingdom from your hands. It will be given to another." Murmur spread through the crowd. Fear, uncertainty. Solomon's fingers clenched into fists. His jaw tightened. "You to say such things," he spat. "Who are you to question the wisdom of a king?" The prophet did not respond. He turned and walked away. Consequences of a king's choice. At night Solomon could not sleep. The words of the prophet echoed in his mind. "God has torn the kingdom from your hands." The length of his chambers, his thoughts spiraling. Had he truly lost everything? Could he turn back? Could he change his fate? It carried him to the temple he had built. He stepped inside, the flickering torchlight casting shadows along the golden walls. He knelt before the altar, his voice barely above a whisper. "Forgive me." Voice from the heavens. No presence, nothing. And closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "This house for you, and now it stands empty, just as I do." March of the enemy came with a bitter wind. The enemy. Banners darkened the horizon, their weapons gleamed in the morning sun. They had no fear. They knew what Solomon already knew. His favor was gone. The king's heart had strayed. So the kingdom would fall. He stood on the city walls, his hands gripping the stone. He watched as the enemy approached, his mind replaying the choices that had led him here. Decision at a time. One compromise after another. I thought it would end like this. "It come to this," he whispered. No answer. The sound of war drums. Final prayer of a king. Night Solomon prayed for the last time. "I have strayed, I see that now. But let this punishment fall on me alone. Spare my people. Do not let them suffer for my mistakes." First time in a long time, he was sincere. Some consequences cannot be undone. Prayers come too late. All of a kingdom. Enemy struck at dawn. Jerusalem, once untouchable, now lay open for the taking. Streets ran with chaos. The people cried out in terror. The great city, the city of David, was crumbling. The battle raged on. Solomon knew it was over. The kingdom had fallen. A single night, not in a single battle, but in 1,000 small compromises. The final breath of a king, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It does not come with warning bells or flashing lights. It comes softly, subtly, and before you know it, you are ensnared. The armor of righteousness. The armory was dimly lit, its ancient walls lined with weapons and armor that had seen the test of time. Daniel stood in the center, his face drawn, filled with both fear and resolve. Before him stood a suit of armor, its steel glinting faintly in the dim light. Daniel reached out and ran his fingers over its surface, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth in his chest. The weight of his past decisions pressed heavily on him as he contemplated the battle ahead. He murmured to himself, almost as though speaking to the armor, "Lord, I don't know what lies ahead, but I trust you. I've made my mistakes, but I believe you will equip me for what's coming." As the silence lingered, Daniel's mind wandered to the stories of those who came before him. The face of Solomon flashed in his memory, kneeling before the temple in his final days, pleading for mercy. Daniel knew Solomon had faced similar battles. Battles not just of the flesh, but of the spirit. The weight of the choices he had made was something Daniel understood all too well. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Eliab approaching, his expression filled with concern but also with a sense of understanding. Eliab stopped just a few feet from Daniel and spoke softly, yet with a firm conviction. "You don't have to do this alone, Daniel," Eliab said, his voice filled with warmth and reassurance. "The Lord is with you. He will equip you for what lies ahead. Trust him." Daniel's voice cracked slightly as he responded, the uncertainty in his heart apparent. "But how? How can I trust that God will lead me? After everything I've done, how can I believe he'll give me victory?" Eliab placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, offering a firm but compassionate grip. "It's not about what you can do, Daniel. It's about what God can do. His strength is made perfect in our weakness. You don't need to fight this battle on your own. You're never alone in his arms." For a moment, Daniel stood in silence, feeling the tension in his heart ease just slightly as Eliab's words sank in. The storm raging outside the armory echoed in his mind, mirroring the storm in his soul. But in that moment he felt something else. A small flicker of hope, a spark that perhaps, just perhaps, the battle was winnable. The final victory. The battlefield was grim. The air was thick with the sounds of clashing swords and the shouts of warriors locked in battle. Daniel stood at the forefront, gripping his sword with both hands, his face pale but filled with a quiet determination. The weight of his armor felt heavier than ever as he surveyed the chaos around him. Yet, despite the battle, there was something else in his heart. Peace. A peace that came from knowing he was not alone, that God was with him. Daniel raised his sword high, his voice steady as he shouted into the chaos. "Lord, I don't know what lies ahead, but I trust you. I've failed, but I believe you will lead me through this." As he spoke, his mind again flashed back to Solomon's final days, the king's plea for mercy echoing in his ears. Daniel could almost feel the weight of Solomon's regrets, his plea for forgiveness, and his ultimate trust in God's redemption. Daniel knew this was not just a battle for survival. It was a battle for his soul. Eliab's voice cut through the noise as he appeared beside Daniel, his face calm but filled with unwavering confidence. "You're not alone in this, Daniel," Eliab said, his voice filled with assurance. "The Lord is with you. He will give you the strength to face what's ahead." Daniel's eyes met Eliab's, and for a moment the doubt that had plagued him seemed to fade. "But what if I fail again?" he asked, his voice filled with fear. Eliab's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Failure is not the end, Daniel. It's the beginning of grace. God will lead you to victory, not because of what you've done, but because of what He has done for you. The words settled in Daniel's heart, and for the first time he felt truly ready to face the battle before him. His grip on the sword tightened, and he stepped forward, his heart filled with newfound resolve. The legacy of faith. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the sky, Daniel stood on the hillside, looking out over the world he had once known. His journey had been filled with hardships and struggles, but it had also been filled with grace and redemption. The peace in his heart was not born of his own strength, but of God's. He knew now that the battle he had fought was not just for his own soul, but for the souls of those who would come after him. "Lord, I don't know what lies ahead, but I trust you," Daniel whispered softly, his voice full of gratitude. "I've made mistakes, but I know your love is greater than all of them. Thank you for never giving up on me." He thought back to the moments of despair he had faced, the times when he had fallen to temptation and felt like giving up. But through it all, God had been faithful. His love had never failed him. Eliab approached, standing beside Daniel as they both looked out over the horizon. The air was calm now, and the storm that had once raged inside Daniel seemed to have passed. "You've come a long way, Daniel," Eliab said, his voice filled with pride. "Your story isn't just your own. It's a story of redemption, a story of grace. You're a beacon of hope for others who are lost, a reminder that no one is beyond God's reach." Daniel turned to face Eliab, his heart full of humility. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly, "but I'm grateful. Grateful for God's mercy and for the chance to start again." Eliab smiled and nodded. "None of us deserve it, Daniel. That's the beauty of grace. It's not about what we've done, but about what God has done for us." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the peacefulness of the present contrasting sharply with the struggles of the past. Daniel felt at peace, knowing that his journey had not been in vain. His legacy would not be defined by his mistakes, but by the grace that had carried him through. As the sun set behind them, Daniel's heart was full, and he knew that this was not the end of his story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter filled with hope, faith, and the power of redemption. A moment of reflection. As the days passed, Daniel found himself reflecting more on the battles he had faced. The physical conflicts on the battlefield were one thing, but the war within him was far greater. He had fought against temptation, against the lies that had bound him, and against his own doubts. Yet, as he sat on the edge of a quiet riverbank one evening, he could sense a peace that had eluded him for so long. The ripples in the water mirrored the calm in his heart. He stared at the water for a long time, his fingers brushing the surface as he spoke softly to himself. "Lord, how do I repay the mercy you've shown me? How do I live a life worthy of the grace I've received?" Eliab appeared beside him, walking silently across the grass and sitting down without a word. The sound of the river flowing was the only noise between them. He had become Daniel's closest confidant, and over time, Eliab had shared wisdom and advice that had guided Daniel through the darkest of times. "You don't need to repay grace, Daniel," Eliab said after a long pause, his voice calm but filled with deep truth. "Grace is freely given, it's not earned, and it can't be paid back. All we can do is live in response to it." Daniel turned to look at his friend, feeling the weight of those words. "But surely there must be something I can do, a way to show my gratitude for all that I've been given." Eliab smiled gently. "The greatest way to show gratitude is to live a life that reflects God's love. To love others the way He has loved you. To forgive others the way He has forgiven you. You don't need to do anything grand. Just be faithful in the small things, and God will do the rest." The simplicity of Eliab's words settled deeply in Daniel's heart. He had spent so long thinking that redemption was something to be earned, a reward for good behavior or righteous acts. But now, he realized that redemption was not a transaction. It was a gift, the call to serve. One day, word came that a neighboring village was under siege. The threat was imminent, and the warriors of the land had been called to defend their brothers and sisters. Daniel knew that this was his moment, not just to fight, but to serve. He had spent so much time thinking about his own redemption, his own battles, but now he saw the greater purpose: to protect, to lead, and to fight for others. As the call to arms rang through the air, Daniel stood at the gates of the armory once more, his heart pounding with both fear and anticipation. The armor that had once seemed a burden now felt like a mantle of duty. And the sword in his hand was no longer just a weapon. It was a tool to protect the innocent. Eliab came up beside him, ready for the battle. His face was grim, but there was no doubt in his eyes. "This is what we're made for, Daniel. To fight for those who cannot fight for themselves." Daniel nodded, his voice firm. "I understand now, Eliab. It's not just about me anymore. It's about what I can do for others. It's about serving with all the strength God has given me." The two men looked at each other, the silent understanding between them speaking volumes. They were no longer fighting for personal victory. They were fighting for the future, for those who depended on them. Scene 30. The Battle of Faith. The battle was fierce. As Daniel and Eliab led the charge into the heart of the enemy's camp, the air was thick with the clash of swords and the cries of warriors. Daniel fought with a new sense of purpose, each strike of his sword a reflection of the strength God had provided him. He was no longer the man who had doubted his worth or questioned his ability. He was a warrior of faith, and nothing could stop him. As the battle raged on, Daniel's mind flickered back to the teachings Eliab had shared with him. The lessons about grace, humility, and service. The enemy was strong, but Daniel knew that the true strength came not from his own abilities, but from the divine power that flowed through him. At one point, as Daniel stood momentarily still in the midst of the chaos, he felt a rush of calm. He closed his eyes for a brief moment and whispered a prayer. "Lord, this battle is yours. I trust in your will, and I know you will give us the victory." The words were barely out of his mouth when he felt the surge of strength that only God could provide. With renewed vigor, he charged forward, leading the attack with Eliab by his side. Together they fought not just as warriors, but as men of faith, trusting that God would guide their every step. The battle stretched long into the night, but when the dust finally settled, the enemy had been repelled. Daniel stood at the front of the battlefield, his chest heaving with exhaustion, but his spirit unbroken. He had fought for something greater than himself, and that made all the difference. The return home. As Daniel and Eliab returned to their village, the cheers of the people rang out in celebration. The battle was over, and the village had been saved. But Daniel's heart was not filled with pride or arrogance. Instead, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the strength that had carried him through the battle. When they entered the village, Daniel was greeted with warm embraces and heartfelt thanks. Yet, amidst the celebrations, he knew that the real victory lay not in the cheers of the people, but in the peace he had found within himself. He had truly embraced the armor of righteousness, and it had transformed him. Eliab stood beside him, watching the celebrations unfold. "You've done it, Daniel," he said quietly, "not just as a warrior, but as a man of faith." Daniel smiled softly, his eyes scanning the faces of those around him. "No," he replied. "We've done it, all of us, and we will continue to do it, together. This victory belongs to all of us, and to the one who gave us the strength to fight." And as the sun set behind the village, casting a golden glow over the scene, Daniel knew that this was not the end of his journey. It was just the beginning, a new chapter of faith, service, and redemption. The challenge of leadership. As the village rejoiced in the victory they had secured, Daniel felt a quiet stir within his soul. The cheers of the people, the adulation of his actions, seemed distant to him. He had never sought glory, never sought to be seen as a hero, yet here he was, a leader, a man others looked to for guidance and inspiration. It was one thing to fight in battle, but another to lead with integrity in times of peace. Daniel knew that leadership was more than simply commanding armies or winning battles. It was about nurturing the hearts and minds of those around him, guiding them with wisdom and compassion. One evening, as the village celebrated, Daniel found himself walking alone through the fields, reflecting on his new role. His heart was heavy, not with the weight of the past battles, but with the weight of the responsibility he now carried. Lord, how do I lead these people? I've been a warrior, a man of mistakes and regrets. How can I be the leader they need? Daniel whispered into the stillness of the night. The wind rustled through the trees, a reminder that God's presence was never far. Eliab, ever watchful of his friend, approached and sat beside him on the grass. Sometimes, leadership isn't about being the strongest or the smartest, Eliab said, his voice carrying a deep understanding. It's about being the most faithful. It's about putting the needs of others before your own and trusting God to lead you in every decision. Daniel nodded slowly, his mind turning over Eliab's words. He had been so focused on his own redemption, so focused on the battles he had fought within himself, that he had forgotten the importance of guiding others through their own struggles. Leadership, he now realized, was not about power, it was about service, humility, and sacrifice. The temptation of pride. As Daniel's reputation spread, so did the temptation of pride. More people came to him for counsel, for guidance, for help. His name became synonymous with victory and faith, and with each new compliment and request, Daniel felt a subtle shift inside him. He began to question his own humility. Had he truly changed, or had he simply traded one form of pride for another? One afternoon, as he sat in the village square, a group of young men approached him, eager to hear his wisdom. They spoke with reverence, their eyes filled with awe as they looked at him. "You are a great warrior, Daniel," one of them said. "You've defeated our enemies, led us to victory, and shown us what it means to trust in God. We seek your guidance in all things." Daniel could feel the weight of their words, and for a fleeting moment, something inside him stirred. Something dangerous. The part of him that had once craved recognition, the part of him that had been driven by the need for approval, rose up. He had overcome the temptation of sin in battle, but now he faced a different kind of test. The temptation of pride. His thoughts became clouded as he considered the power he held. It would be so easy to embrace it, to claim the admiration that was being showered upon him. But deep down, Daniel knew that this was a battle of a different kind, the battle of the heart. He excused himself from the group and walked away, seeking solitude in the quiet of the fields. As he sat beneath an ancient tree, he whispered a prayer, confessing the struggle in his heart. "Lord, I don't want to fall back into the same traps that once ensnared me. I don't want to become prideful and forget the purpose you've given me. Help me to stay humble and always remember that it's not about me, but about you." In that moment, the storm inside him quieted. He knew that the real victory was not in external praise, but in keeping his heart aligned with God's will. He had to remain vigilant. Pride was a silent enemy, one that could destroy everything he had worked for. The return of temptation. Even after the battle was won, Daniel knew that temptation would always return. It was not a one-time victory. It was a lifelong struggle. The old habits, the old fears, the old doubts, they would always try to resurface. Daniel understood that now. One evening, as he sat in the quiet of his home, a knock came at the door. It was a woman from the village, beautiful, graceful, and with eyes that held a depth of emotion that Daniel could not ignore. She had come seeking counsel, or so she said. At first, Daniel was kind, offering her the wisdom he had learned through his own struggles. But as the conversation continued, he began to notice something in her eyes, a glimmer of something more, something that threatened to stir up the old temptations he had long since buried. He could feel his resolve slipping. The pull of desire was strong, and for a brief moment, the armor of righteousness felt light. Too light. He was standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss of temptation. But just as he was about to give in, a memory flashed before him. The faces of those he loved, the people he had sworn to protect, the God he had promised to serve. The moment passed, and with it, the temptation faded. He stood up, his voice steady but firm. "Forgive me," Daniel said. "I cannot give you what you seek. My heart belongs to God, and I cannot turn away from His calling for me. Please, go and find what you seek elsewhere." The woman's expression faltered, but she left without another word. Daniel felt the weight of his decision settle on him. It had been a difficult test, but he had passed it. He had stayed true to the armor of righteousness that had been entrusted to him, the path of discipleship. Daniel knew that his journey was far from over. Though he had overcome many of the temptations that had once ruled his life, he knew there would be more battles to face. He had learned that redemption was not a destination, it was a path that he would walk every day, with each decision and each act of faith. As he walked through the village one day, he saw the faces of those he had fought for, the people whose lives had been touched by his transformation. They were not looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking at him as a leader, as someone they could follow. And with that responsibility came the reminder that he was not just a man saved from his past, he was a disciple of Christ, called to serve and to guide others on their own journey of faith. Eliab stood by his side as they walked together, the weight of the road ahead pressing on them both. "Now you begin a new battle," Eliab said, "the battle for others' hearts. To lead them in the same way you've been led, to show them that the armor of righteousness is not just for you, but for all who will receive it." Daniel nodded, feeling the truth of those words. He had been saved, but he was called to help save others. It was no longer enough to just walk the path himself. He was called to disciple others, to show them the way to redemption, a test of faith. Weeks passed, and Daniel's role as a leader in the village grew ever more complex. The people continued to seek his counsel, and though he was grateful for the trust they placed in him, he sometimes found himself feeling overwhelmed. Every day brought new challenges, some physical, some emotional, and many spiritual. One morning as he was walking through the village, a young woman came running toward him. Her face was pale with fear, and her eyes were wide with distress. "Daniel, please help," she cried, her voice trembling. "My father has fallen ill. He's been struck with a fever, and the healers say they cannot help him. They say he's beyond saving." Daniel felt a pang of fear in his own heart. He had seen death claim many lives in his time, and the idea of losing another member of his community weighed heavily on him. But more than that, there was a deep stirring within him, a reminder that he had been called not just to fight battles, but to restore life. "Take me to him," Daniel said, his voice calm and firm. "The Lord will guide us through this." As they arrived at the woman's home, Daniel saw her father lying on a simple bed, his body racked with fever. His breathing was shallow, his face pale. The air in the room was thick with the smell of sickness, and Daniel could see the fear in the eyes of those gathered around him. They had already begun to prepare for the worst. But Daniel, though afraid, knew this was a test of his faith. He had seen God's power before, and he knew that nothing was impossible for the Lord. He knelt beside the bed, placing his hand on the man's forehead. For a moment, the room was silent, and all eyes were on Daniel. "Lord," Daniel whispered, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his heart. "You are the healer of all things. I place this man in your hands, trusting that you will give him the strength to recover. Restore him, O God, and bring peace to his body and his family." There was a long, tense silence. Daniel could feel the weight of the moment, the weight of the people's expectations, and the weight of his own doubts. But he trusted in God's plan, no matter what the outcome would be. After a few moments, the man's breathing became steadier. His fever began to break. His daughter gasped in disbelief, and the others in the room fell to their knees in awe. "Thank you, Lord," Daniel whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you for your mercy." The man, now awake, slowly opened his eyes and smiled faintly at Daniel. "Thank you, young man. You are truly a servant of the Most High." Daniel bowed his head in humility, grateful for the miracle but also reminded of the weight of the responsibility that came with his role. As the room erupted in joy and praise, Daniel felt the deep stirrings of his faith being tested in new ways. The burden of responsibility. As time passed, Daniel began to realize that the victory in one area of life did not mean an end to struggles in another. Despite the gratitude of the villagers and the visible growth in his own faith, there was a subtle, creeping burden he could not ignore. The more people he helped, the more his soul yearned for rest. His body had fought countless battles, but it was his spirit that needed tending now. Eliab, ever the supportive friend, noticed the change in Daniel. The lines on his face had deepened, his eyes growing weary. One evening, after Daniel had just finished counseling a group of villagers, Eliab found him sitting alone by a campfire, staring into the flickering flames. "Daniel," Eliab began gently, sitting beside him, "you've done much for this village, but you cannot give what you don't have. You've been pouring out your strength, but I see the toll it's taking on you. When was the last time you took a moment to just rest in God's presence?" Daniel looked up, his face a mixture of frustration and guilt. "I can't afford to rest, Eliab. These people need me. They need someone to guide them, to lead them in the way of faith. If I rest, who will care for them?" Eliab shook his head, his voice calm but insistent. "You cannot lead others if you're running on empty. Even the greatest warriors must take time to rest and recharge. God has given you a calling, but He also calls you to come to Him for renewal. You can't do it all alone. Let Him fill you so that you can continue to serve." Daniel sat in silence for a long while, the weight of Eliab's words settling in. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on handling every challenge with his own strength. But now he saw the truth. The well of his own power was running dry, and only through rest in God could he continue to serve with the fullness of heart that the people deserved. A time of renewal. The next morning, Daniel withdrew from the busyness of the village. He walked to a quiet place by the river, the soft sounds of water flowing over rocks, soothing his weary soul. He knelt by the water, allowing the peace of the moment to wash over him. "Lord," he prayed, "I have done all I can with the strength you've given me, but now I need your strength. I need your peace to fill me, to restore my soul. I cannot go on in my own power anymore. I surrender everything to you." For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a deep sense of peace. The burden that had weighed heavily on his shoulders seemed to lift, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. God had not abandoned him. He had simply called Daniel to rest in him, so that he could continue to fulfill the mission he had been given. As Daniel spent time in solitude, reconnecting with God, he realized that his journey was never meant to be a solo mission. He was part of a greater work, a body of believers working together to build God's kingdom. He was not called to carry the burden alone, but to rely on God and on those around him to help bear the weight of the task. The call to discipleship. As Daniel returned to the village, he felt renewed. He had learned an important lesson. True leadership comes not from self-reliance, but from reliance on God and on the community of believers around him. He was not the source of strength for the village, the Lord was. His role was to guide others toward that truth. Daniel began to focus more on raising up others to lead alongside him. He took young men and women under his wing, teaching them the lessons he had learned through his own struggles and victories. He showed them that the armor of righteousness was not something that could be worn alone. It was a collective armor, a shared strength built on community and faith. In time, the village transformed. It became a place not just of physical safety, but of spiritual renewal. People were not just coming to Daniel for answers, they were becoming leaders themselves, learning to walk in the same faith and strength that had carried Daniel through his own battles. The burden of sacrifice. The village had flourished under Daniel's leadership. More and more people came to him seeking guidance, and it seemed as though the work he had started was growing. Yet, with each passing day, Daniel felt a heaviness in his heart, a burden he could not shake. The sacrifices of leadership were beginning to weigh on him, and he found himself waking early in the mornings and staying late into the night, always striving to meet the needs of others. One evening, as the sky turned dark and the first stars began to appear, Daniel walked to a high hill that overlooked the village. From there, he could see the lights of the homes, the people gathered around fires, and the families enjoying peace. But in his heart, Daniel still felt a gnawing emptiness. He had given so much, but in doing so he had begun to lose sight of something important, the depth of his own spiritual life. As he gazed out at the village, he whispered to himself, "Lord, I am doing everything for others, but I feel like I am losing myself. I've given my time, my strength, my very soul to this cause, but what happens when I have nothing left to give? The wind rustled through the trees, and Daniel closed his eyes, praying for strength. He knew he had to make a choice. The more he poured out, the more he needed to be filled. Leadership, he realized, was not just about giving, it was also about receiving. He needed to return to God's presence, to replenish his spirit, so that he could continue to lead with authenticity and grace. Scene 24. The call to serve again. Days later, a new challenge arrived in the form of a neighboring village that was experiencing a severe famine. News had traveled quickly that their crops had failed and their people were in desperate need of food and supplies. Daniel felt the stirring of compassion in his heart, but this time, he knew that the journey would be different. He could not lead the way he had before, running on empty. As he gathered the village leaders together, Daniel spoke with renewed conviction. We cannot ignore the suffering of others. The Lord has blessed us with abundance, and now it is our turn to serve. But this time, we must do it differently. We must serve with humility, with generosity, and with hearts that are full of God's love. Eliab stood beside him, nodding in agreement. It is not just about what we give, but how we give. The Lord has provided for us, and now we are called to share. But remember, Daniel, we cannot lead this effort in our own strength. We must rely on God to guide us and provide. Daniel knew that this was not only a test of physical resources, but a test of spiritual strength. The people in the neighboring village needed more than just food. They needed hope, they needed faith, and they needed to see God's love in action. But as he prepared to take on this mission, Daniel understood that it was not about leading alone. It was about leading in partnership with God and his fellow believers. The journey of compassion, the journey to the neighboring village, was long and arduous. The roads were rough, and the heat of the sun bore down on the travelers, but Daniel led with a renewed sense of purpose. The group carried with them bags of grain, water, and supplies, but they also carried something far more important: a mission to show the love of God in tangible ways. As they arrived, Daniel could see the stark reality of the famine. The people of the village looked weary, their faces drawn with hunger and despair. It was evident that they had been struggling for weeks without hope of relief. But as Daniel and the others set up camp and began to distribute supplies, something shifted in the atmosphere. The people began to gather, their eyes filled with both skepticism and wonder. One woman approached Daniel, her hands trembling as she took the water from his hands. "You've come to help us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel looked her in the eye, his voice gentle. "We have come to serve you, not out of obligation, but out of love. The Lord has provided for us, and now we share what we have with you." The woman's eyes filled with tears as she bowed her head in gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, and Daniel could see the relief in her expression. Over the next few days, Daniel and his people worked tirelessly to help the village. They provided not only food and water, but also medical care, shelter, and a sense of community. They prayed with the people, shared stories of God's provision, and reminded them that they were not alone. Yet through it all, Daniel felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His heart, once burdened with the weight of leadership, now felt light. He was no longer leading out of obligation or expectation. He was leading because he had returned to the heart of God's calling, to serve others with humility, compassion, and love. The true measure of leadership. As the days passed, the famine began to subside. The neighboring village started to heal, not just physically but spiritually. The people had begun to see God's provision in a new light, and many came to faith through the generosity and compassion they had experienced. One evening, as Daniel sat with Eliab under the stars, he reflected on the journey. The struggle, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt, they all led to this. He had learned that leadership was not about power or position, but about serving others with a heart that sought to reflect God's love in every action. Eliab turned to Daniel, his face reflecting the pride he felt for his friend. "You've done well, Daniel. The people have seen your heart, and they have seen God's love through you. This is the true measure of leadership. Daniel smiled, his heart full. It's not about me, Eliab. It's about God working through me. I've learned that leadership is not something to be achieved, it is something to be lived. We lead by example, by showing others the love of God, not in grand gestures, but in small acts of kindness, humility, and service. The two men sat in silence, watching as the stars twinkled above them. Daniel knew that the journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time he felt a deep peace in his soul. He had found the true path of leadership, not through power or glory, but through selfless service and a heart completely surrendered to God. A life marked by service. Years passed, and Daniel's story continued to inspire others. The village had grown, both in number and in faith. Daniel, now an elder in the community, had passed on the mantle of leadership to the next generation, but his legacy was not just in the deeds he had done. It was in the lives he had touched and the hearts he had transformed. One day, as Daniel sat with a group of young people by the river, he shared with them the story of his life. He spoke of his struggles, his failures, and his moments of doubt, but he also spoke of the grace that had carried him through. He reminded them that leadership was not about standing at the front, it was about serving from the heart. You don't need a title to lead, Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. You lead by the way you love, by the way you serve, and by the way you reflect God's grace in everything you do. As the sun set on the village, Daniel felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His life had not been perfect, but it had been marked by God's love and service, and in the end, that was all that mattered.